Radio TV phono nut here, and today we have a battery-operated Montgomery Ward Airline radio, probably from about 1937 or so. This is about as basic as it gets. Little 4-tube set that receives the standard broadcast band only. And here's the back of the chassis, little 4-tube chassis with a pin drive high impedance magnetic speaker. That's their way of eliminating the output transformer. And somebody attached these to the filament supply line. I hope they didn't connect that to a 6.3 volt storage battery. And then here are our B plus connectors. This requires 90 volts and 67.5 volts, and I believe the filament supply is 2 volts. Here's our label in the back of the radio. I'm making some preliminary checks. Let's check across the filament line and see if we get anything. Okay, we're getting a little something there, which tells us the switch is functioning and the tubes are not burned out, so that's good. Now let's check this speaker for continuity. If we can get the probe to stay on there. 1.5K, so the speaker has a good coil. That's good. If it was bad, our only option would be to install an audio output transformer and a more modern PM speaker, which would improve the sound quality, but it would not be original at that point. This is a model 62304. We have a 1D7 first detector and oscillator, 1D5 IF amplifier, 1H6 second detector and AF amp, and a 1F5 output tube. And this will run off of, as far as our filament supply, you can run this off of either a 3-volt battery or a 2-volt battery, depending on the setting of this rheostat here. And then, like I've already said, 67 volts and 90 volts for the B+, so let's see if we can put some juice to this and see what happens. I swear, these alligator clip test leads are getting cheaper and cheaper. Brand new test lead, and I'm checking the continuity of them before I use them. And you can see that one is bouncing around all over the place. It's because they don't solder them to the clips. They just crimp them on and they make poor contact. It's a brand new set of leads. Garbage. Well, this one here is better, but it's reading 1.3 ohms. It should read 0 ohms. Yeah, they just fold the leads over, stick them in here, and crimp it in place, and they really don't even do a good job of crimping them, because I can pull these clips straight off of here, so it looks like before we get into the radio repair, we're going to have to service the brand new test leads. And I've got enough of these fixed to do what we need to do today, but nothing makes me any madder than to have a project in mind and then have to stop and get derailed because of some nonsense like this. I think in the future, seeing as how you really can't buy, that I know of, decent quality ready-made clip leads, I'm going to start making my own out of hookup wire and alligator clips, and then there shouldn't be any problems in the future. Alright, the Grundig's really not doing anything with that, so that could have been just my imagination. Okay, we're connected, so let's turn it on and see what happens. It appears nothing is happening. Okay, we're pulled from the cabinet and fired up. We've got B+ voltage on our output and first audio and detector tubes, but absolutely no audio at all from the speaker. Let's see if we have any filament voltage making its way to the tubes. And I have no audio whatsoever coming out of the speaker. Let's look at our plate load resistor on the first audio tube. The input of that resistor is 88 volts B+. The other side of that resistor is 81 volts. That seems a little high to me, which leads me to believe that that tube might not be conducting. I can also tell you that this coupling cap between the first audio and audio output tube is leaky because I've got 12 volts on the control grid of the audio output tube, so let's get that out of the way. Well, replacing that coupling cap didn't restore my audio, which I didn't figure it would, but it was bad, so we might as well have gone ahead and replaced it. But that did bring our plate voltage up a little bit on the 186. So on the input side of our plate load resistor, we have 88 volts. On the output side, we now have 84. Now, they don't give the voltages on this diagram, but 84 seems a bit high to me. And that leads me to believe that this 186 is probably defective. And another possibility would be possibly this 100 ohm resistor or this 150 ohm resistor. This is a directly heated tube, which means the heater and the cathode are one and the same, and one side of our filament goes back down here to A+, and then the other side of our filament connects to chassis ground. And if we look here, there's a couple of resistors here. We have 150 ohm. One end connects to B-, the other end connects to a junction of 100 ohm and a 2 meg ohm, and the other end of this 100 ohm goes back down here through the switch, back down here to the rheostat. It goes back around here to chassis ground. And it also goes back around to A- through the other portion of the switch. So, yeah, that could be, those two resistors could be a problem, or these tubes, or that tube could be a problem. Alright, let's see what the survey says. The survey says it is nearly dead. It just barely moves the pointer. Let's crank the heater voltage up a little bit to 3. We ain't got nothing to lose, and see what happens. Yep, that tube is dead. Well, as luck would have it, I found a 186 used, which we don't care as long as it's good, in my tube stash. And this one is very, very good. In fact, I'm going to back the filament voltage back down to 1 and see how it tests. Not too well on 1, but tests just fine on 2, so let's go with it. Now with that tube in place, I'm getting 39 volts B+, which is more like about what it ought to be. And a dog, it won't shut. Well, we still were not getting any audio, and when I touch the control grid of the output tube, I get a very, 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 very faint buzz. And it shouldn't be overly loud, but it should be louder than what I'm getting. And guess what? This tube is near dead too. So what's somebody do to this thing? Let's put it up on 3 volts just for fun and see what happens. So I guess we're going to go look in our lucky tube box and see if there's a 1F5 in there. But first I'm going to go see if there's a substitute for that in case I find another type in that box. And the lucky tube box produced a 1F5. Let's see if it's any good. Oh yeah, that's a lot better. So let's go stick that in the radio and see if that helps us any. Alright, touching the center of the volume control, we now have audio, but we have no stations. Oh, and I did tack in a new electrolytic to replace this one that we know is going to be bad, but let's start checking more voltages, starting in the IF amplifier stage. And the 1D5 IF amplifier tube is not too good, reads about halfway up to bad. It should still do something though. In the 1D7, this tube tester doesn't even have a setting for that. Now I found a 1D5, it tests very good, but no 1D7. I did find a 1A7, which I'm going to look and see if there's a way we can make that work if need be, but we don't know that the 1A7, the 1D7 that was originally in the set is bad or not, but based on the other three being bad, it could very well be. Now on something like this, I would say that some shyster swapped out the good tubes for duds, but all of these in this set appear to be the original Ward's Airline tubes, so apparently whoever had this radio ran it into the ground. Alright, I don't think the oscillator is running, because when I bring my transistor radio up close to it, and if you're wondering why the back's off of it, that's because a switch crapped out in it, and I have it jumpered just for this test. I get white noise, but I do not hear anything as I tune across the dial on our donor let me rephrase that. I don't hear any changes in our transistor radio speaker as I tune across the dial on our battery set that we're working on, so I think our oscillator is dead. Okay, it looks like the 1A5 has the same pinout as a 1D5. The 1D5 calls for 2 volts on the filament. The 1A5, or excuse me, whatever this is, the 2D7 or 1D7 has the same pinout as a 1A7, which I have. The only difference seems to be the 1A7 calls for 1.4 volts, the 1D7 calls for 2, so I'm going to test the 1D7 as a 1A7, and it's dead as a doornail too. And our 1A7 is good. Now this is not the ideal replacement because of the lower filament voltage, but it'll work long enough for a test to see if we get any kind of activity. And it looks like that brought it to life. So every tube in this radio was dead.
The Queen City newsletter. It's starting. Find it. From the Queen City and surrounding Apple is that I can tend to dominate a conversation. Enjoy talking. I have an answer for everything. If you haven't figured it out, I've already figured it out. And
I'm going to turn this rheostat more towards the 3 volt position.
Take a breath. Just breathe in. You know, it is that pausing, Doug, like you said. It's almost like I had this view that God is sovereign. He is
have a little compromise voltage there, because technically we're overvolting this 1A7 just a little bit. Okay, well I thought the sports was gone off of 1010, but I guess I spoke too soon. And this decoupling cap on the 67 volt B plus line is very leaky. When I take the ground end loose, it starts out at about 30 volts there, and it's slowly dropping down to, we're down to 13 volts. So it's well on its way to being toast, and seeing as how it's on a B plus rail, I'd feel better about just going ahead and replacing it. Its purpose is to keep RF off of the 67 volt line to the screen grid of the IF and the oscillator and mixer tube. Well, we ran into a little problem that's going to end sloppily. I was replacing the ratty looking battery cable, and in trying to unsolder the stranded battery cable lead off of pin 1 of this output tube that has 3 other resistors tied to it, it was not cooperating. The wire strands were hanging up. And to make a long story short, eventually the pin just broke clean off at the tube socket. So we're just going to delete that pin we have everything soldered together to our 3 resistors, and they're stable enough on their own, and that's just going to be the way it is. And I'm going to go look and make sure pin 1 is just a tie point pin. I don't believe that goes to anything internal to the tube. If it does, then we got a real problem, because I just really don't want to change this tube socket. Just as I thought, no connection on pin 1 of that output tube, which it usually never is. That's pin 1 is either usually a no connection pin or used for a tube shield in the case of metal tubes. And then in a regular AC operated set, pin 8 of the output tube would be the cathode, but in our case here, since we have a directly heated cathode, then pin 8 is not used on this as well. Alright, I'm going to tweak on these IF trimmers, see if they need to be aligned. Well, that one might have been pretty close. That might have been a little off. Oh, come on, get in there. Well, they were all pretty close. Waste of a good transmitter, forward radio. We're going to have a little capacitor fun here. The 2 capacitors that remain are the AVC filter cap and the coupling cap off of the volume control that isolates the control grid of the first audio tube from the resistance element of the volume control. We're checking the control grid voltage on that tube, and we're reading negative 0.79 volts. And at maximum volume, we're reading about 0.8, 0.9 volts. I want to lift one end of that cap and then tack in a fresh new cap and see if we notice any change of reading and see if we notice any change in volume level or fidelity. And if we don't, then we'll just tack the other cap back in there. Okay, with that capacitor tacked in place with a new one in place of the old one, we do get more volume, I believe. And at maximum volume, our grid voltage is down to like 0.74, 73, 77. So yes, I do believe that this cap is improving things. Let's double check that though. Alright, new cap. Well, maybe not a lot of difference. Well, I think the new one is a little louder. So we'll just go ahead and replace it just for good measure. Now, even if that cap were dead short, it wouldn't blow up anything. There's no voltage to amount to anything there. Alright, cap's installed, and I think we do have more volume now.
How hard is it getting prepared for pitching in the 10 midweek games ahead of an SEC? So you'll probably see some faces you haven't seen.
And that's not even with an antenna connected, just a little stub sticking out of the back of the radio. Now I'm clipped onto the AVC filter capacitor, and its job is to keep any RF or anything off of the AVC line. We don't want that on the AVC line. That would result in little to no reception and some oscillation. And so I'm checking the DC voltage on that line, and we're reading negative 1.7 volts. And let's change the station. Now we're at a weaker station, negative 1.3. Now we're on no station, negative 0.8.
I'll put you on the spot. You can delay this till tomorrow, but any ideas on...
Let's turn the volume up a little bit. $13.90, negative 1.2, a weaker 1450, negative 1 volt. So basically what the AVC does when it's tuned to a weak station, it tells the front end stages of the radio, the IF amplifier and the converter stage, I need you to work a little harder here. We got a weak station coming in. And then whenever you tune to a stronger station, it tells the converter and IF stage you don't have to work quite as hard on this. And the whole objective for AVC, automatic volume control, is to help keep the volume level at a reasonably at the same level between a weaker station and a stronger station. Otherwise, if you tune to a weaker station and crank it up, crank the volume wide open to hear it, and then whenever you tune back to a stronger station, it would literally blow you out of the room, and that's what the AVC circuit is supposed to help eliminate. So we're going to do just like we did on the other. We're reading negative 1 volt on this 1450, which is a weaker station, and like I said, we have no antenna attached, so now whenever I touch the antenna terminal, which results in increased reception, our voltage goes to negative 3 volts. Alright, let's leave it right there, negative 1.2 volts. Let's swap in another capacitor and see what kind of changes that makes, if any. Now right now I have the capacitor completely out of circuit, and this is all we get, just some oscillation. Okay, before we had negative 1.2 on 13.90, and we got about negative 1.3 now, so hadn't a whole lot changed, but we replaced all the capacitors, so that ought to make the internet happy. Now, maybe changing those final 2 capacitors helped our performance a bit. It's been my experience that changing the a defective volume control coupling capacitor will usually just cause distortion at high volume. But like I've said before, in no case should you just take a radio without doing checks or anything on it and just do a shotgun recap. That's just asking for trouble. You're not learning anything about troubleshooting. All you're learning how to do is change parts, and you may end up introducing problems that weren't there to start with. My method, we may end up with all of the paper capacitors replaced, but I generally show along the way why they're being replaced, and we check the set after each one to make sure we haven't taken any steps backwards. Alright, I cleaned the tuning condenser. It was cutting out at the low end of the band. I think it had a plate that was slightly bent. We're listening to 700 WLW out of Cincinnati at the moment. WSM. But oddly enough, it seems once you get below a certain point, it cuts out, or the sensitivity drops way off. And then whenever I raise it back up, it doesn't kick back in until we get almost to the top of the dial, and then it kicks back in. So that's weird. And now it's gone away again. Let's turn it back up. So what kind of crap is this? I don't think I've ever seen one do that before.
Thanks for the comment. Finds the stretch of competing brands. Anything is things. Building maintenance, allowing people who care. Well, audio is an ideal way for brands to tell their stories.
Everyone.
Free Joe Pack, 833-563-7247, joepacks.com. What's on this?
Office says 41-year-old upgrade. That's over 10,000 communities.
Last order in 2024. We won't see that many.
Tickets still on sale at opera.com. Can't be there as always. You can listen live Thursday night, 7 p.m. Central, here on WSM Radio. On the next topic, he was vilified and hated. After his fourth military move, one being
See, once we get below that, the sensitivity just drops off. It's like the oscillator stops running. And then as I turn the tuning condenser back the other direction, it's like it doesn't kick in until we get to the top of the dial, and then it kicks back in.
By the 1920s, the Wild West was vanishing.
So not only do we have that weird dropout on the front end, our volume control is acting weird. We're at the minimum volume setting. We increase, and then we drop out, and then increase again. So I'll show you.
Democrats as far as some of the cuts that are being made, but there are cuts in this package. Certainly not Republicans feel that Democrats claim are overblown. What about the Senate? What is the likelihood of it passing, and if it doesn't, what happens?
Okay, it's not doing as bad now.
Mostly because some of the Democrats have said that they are taking a wait-and-see approach. I mean, look, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer made clear, and often makes clear during these funding fights that no one wants a shutdown, so that is the posture of congressional leaders writ large, but at the same time,
but it does have a spot right there in the volume control where it drops way down.
Today, the Senate Democrats had, in terms of their regular lunch, but it went over, and we were told it was a very robust and engaging conversation as members kind of debated the path forward.
This stupid radio, this transistor radio, is picking up camera interference. But I'm going to show you, I'll try to show you how to check the oscillator. I have the tube radio's volume turned down so we don't hear extra noise. I have the transistor radio tuned to about 800 or so, and whenever I tune across the band on the tube radio, if the oscillator is working, you should hear the changes in the oscillation taking place in the transistor radio. So I've got the camera as far away from the radio, and now I'm going to tune through the band on the tube radio, and you should hear the oscillation change in the transistor radio. Hear all that? That means our oscillator is working. Now let's see what happens when we get down to the bottom of the band when it cuts out. Okay, that should be the cutout point. Now I'm going higher on the dial on the tube radio, and we're not hearing any oscillation in the transistor radio. So the oscillator is definitely not running. Now when I get up to the very top of the dial, you can hear it kick in. So I think the next thing I want to do is try to find another oscillator and mixer tube and see if that's the problem. And then if it's not, we'll have to investigate further. Now I know that wasn't much to see, but I needed both hands for this, and I needed to get the camera far enough away where the interference from it wouldn't screw with the radio. Now here's another 1A7. Let's see what happened. Okay, it looks like it's cutting out just like the other one did. So it's not the tube. And I have to go all the way to the top of the dial to get the oscillator started again. And yes, I made a boo-boo. I let the soldering iron touch my part of my battery cable here, so I'm going to have to fix that. But anyway, to start with, the radio was cutting out completely below a certain point on the dial. Seen it happen 10 million times in the past. But whenever we went back up the dial, radio came back to life once we got past the short in the tuning capacitor. And then I changed out the AVC filter and then cleaned the tuning capacitor, and then we had oscillator drop out at the bottom, and it's not coming back until we get to the top of the dial. And then once that happens, when you tune back down the dial, it does fine until you get to a certain point at the bottom, and then it drops out. And then the only way you can get it back is to tune back to the top of the dial and start back down again. So, and this is why I say don't do a bulk mass shotgun recap, because at least now I kind of have an idea when things started going downhill. So I put the original AVC filter back in, and yes, I did connect the foil side of the capacitor to the lowest impedance point in the circuit, which in this case is ground, and we're now going to fire it up and see if the oscillator performs normally, or is it going to drop out again. Okay, we're at the top of the dial, and it sounds like we have something.
Probationary workers witnessing engineers in their position were suddenly
WSM. Okay, it does not sound like the oscillator is dropping out now. It's not. It's behaving normally.
I don't know what the Bruises on my arm. National Weather Service. SRN News.
Okay, it's doing fine now.
And more firings are likely coming. Where do you think we're going?
So for whatever reason, it does not like that new capacitor. Now I just got some new capacitors from another vendor that I've never dealt with before, and these look a little bit different than some of the ones I've used in the past.
Turn around the damage that's already been done.
This is not supposed to happen. The internet will tell you this is not supposed to happen. The old capacitor is not supposed to work better than the new one.
And then all of a sudden, was to try to challenge Anthony.
Alright, I put the new cap back in, and now it's behaving normally. Now I tried reversing the plug in the outlet, and it's still not misbehaving. Now I want to try one other thing. I want to reverse that new capacitor around in the circuit and see if that does anything. I've never had an issue with outside foil on a more modern film cap, but I suppose there's a first time for everything. Yeah, we've already had the first time for everything with the oscillator dropping out like it was doing and then wouldn't kick back in until we rotated the tuning knob back up to the top end of the dial. And then it would kick back in and then it would tune normally until we got to that spot at the bottom, and then it would just cut out and wouldn't kick back in until we repeated the process. Alright, cap is reversed. Let's see what happens. And it's still behaving. Yeah, that is some weird crap. I don't know what the heck was causing that. Well, that's enough for today. Battery's about dead. I'm about dead, and it's time to give it a rest. Alright, I'll replace the wiring. I don't know what was taking place with that oscillator, but it has not messed up since. So I'm now ready to do a more in-depth alignment on this. So the first thing we have to do is let our equipment warm up. The triplet signal generator, the radio, and this old school Heathkit oscilloscope. They've been on for at least 30 minutes. And then we need to rotate the tuning dial on the radio to the top of the dial, which will be 730 kC. And then we need to set our generator to 456 kilocycles. And because I don't know how well this is calibrated, we're going to use our Grundig Yacht Boy to assist in that. And since the Grundig Yacht Boy is made for all markets, we can set the Grundig Yacht Boy to 912 kilocycles, which is a harmonic of 456. Set our generator to no modulation, and then we will place the generator output close to the Grundig and set the generator for 0 beat. Alright, I'm going to show you how to do this. We're off frequency, going too far the other way. Now that's 0, that's where we want to be, 456 kilocycles. Now they tell us to connect the low side of the generator to chassis ground and the high side of the generator to the grid of the oscillator mixer tube through a dummy antenna, and they advise to use Joe Biden as a dummy antenna. If a Joe Biden isn't available, then you can use a 0.1 microfarad capacitor. Now the reason for that is we want to make the test equipment invisible to the radio, but instead of using a dummy antenna capacitor, I'm just going to clip the hot lead of our generator to the insulation on our grid cap lead of the 12S, I was about to say 12SA7, that ain't right, but to the grid lead of our 1A7 oscillator and mixer tube. And we're technically supposed to be using the oscilloscope for an output meter, set it for highest amplitude waveform, but I can't even see the trace on it very well out here, so I just try to do it by ear. So we keep the output of the signal generator as low as possible to get a usable reading. We turn the volume control on the radio all the way up, and then we set each trimmer on the IF cams for maximum output. So let's try to do that here. Looks like I'm going to have to move it out a little bit. Okay, that's maximum there. Maximum there. That's about maximum there. And that's about maximum there. Now we'll turn the output of our generator down, and I'll go back through it again. Now they want us to set the generator to 1730, which is not an actual station here, but we're going to do it just like we did before. We have the radio tuned to 1730, the Grundig Yacht Boy that is. We have our signal generator output placed close to the radio, and now let's adjust our signal generator. That sounds to be about right there. And turn on the modulation, and there it is. There we go. And this oscillator is way off. Now the oscillator section generally is going to be the smaller of the two sections on the tuning capacitor. So I'm probably going to need both hands to adjust this, one to hold the chassis and one to adjust the trimmer, so I'll be right back. Alright, that was way off. Now we have to set the generator to 1500 and then set the radio to correspond, and then tune the antenna trimmer on the big section of the cap for maximum output. That's 1500 on the radio. Let's tune the trimmer and see if we can get it any better. Alright, now what they want you to do is tune the generator and the radio to 800, and then put the chassis back in the cabinet and make sure the dial pointer is pointing to 800, and if it's not, you have to loosen this screw and move the dial pointer, and that's going to be kind of tricky, seeing as how the dial scale is not here, it's on the front of the radio, so you're going to have to keep reinserting and removing the chassis until you get it right.
arguments.
Alright, we're back together, and it's about as good as it's going to get.
God, do I miss that shit.
That dial calibration procedure is a real pain in the butt, and it wouldn't have had to have been a pain in the butt had they made this whole dial to come out with a chassis. But no, they didn't do that. That would have been too simple. But with them telling you to put the radio back in the cabinet, set the generator and the dial to 800. If it doesn't come in on 800, pull the chassis back out and align the pointer to 800, and then put it back in. We'll see, how do you know if you're aligning the pointer to 800, physical 800, when the dial is attached to the cabinet? So, and the way this is, the dial accuracy can be determined by what position the chassis is in the cabinet, and you've got a little give there, so there's a lot of factors involved. So I just got it as close as I could, and back together it went. It appears to be sensitive. We don't even have an antenna on it right now, except for the little stubby thing that coming out of the back of the radio where you connect an external antenna. And we need to find another knob for this. This wooden knob is not the correct type. It's loose. This plastic designer knob is the correct type. But that's 1010. That's 910. And see, it's a little off. But
on the Rooster Sports Channel from noon to
1390.
That stores
and 1450
services in the area thrive. Good.
So tonight we'll hook it up to a longer antenna and see what kind of DX we can get on it. I think it'll probably do pretty good. Now we no longer have a 670 as a weak station reference. A storm took their tower out, and who knows when or if they'll ever rebuild. However, it looks like we're getting a 660. It's just barely there. I can't even tell enough about it to get any kind of discernible information. But the yacht boy is picking it up slightly better. Not enough to really tell anything, but it's there. And I was tuning around on the yacht boy, and I'm like, what is this at 1180 with maximum signal? And just a carrier, no modulation, and it's something, obviously it's being picked up off of the local oscillator and the battery set, because whenever I turn the battery set off, it goes away. 1180 is a talk station out of Jackson, which I can barely pick up on the Grundig. So it's all this noise is the reason we can't get a whole lot of distant stations. If this band was quiet, I'm sure we could get some distant stations even in the daytime. Now I will say this, for a radio that uses a cheapo magnetic pen drive 1920s technology speaker, it sounds pretty decent. But with that said, me finding 4 dead tubes, not counting some tubes I've seen that somebody wired wrong and blew the filaments in a battery set. But as far as tubes that died of natural causes, I have never encountered a radio in over 36 years where every tube in it was dead. And I've also never encountered one where the oscillator started doing what this one did and then mysteriously straightened out and hasn't messed up again. So I don't know what that was about either. Now, if we could just do something about all this interference, there's no telling what we could receive on this. You know, back when WMOX was a 250-watt station in 1946, their signal probably went further back then than what a 250-watt station would go today, because back then you didn't have all the interference obliterating everything like you do now. But I don't look for anything to ever be done about that. If anything happens, it'll only get worse. Now, on the subject of all of those tubes and the radio being dead, that would lead me to believe that someone just ran the heck out of that radio, which is unusual because most people who had those battery radios were very conservative with operating them because batteries were expensive and often scarce. And since those radios were battery hogs, then they wanted to make the battery last as long as possible. I know a fella I knew that was a kid during World War II. He said we had an old Silvertone battery set that ran off of the 1.5 volt and 90 volt battery pack. And he said during the war it was difficult to impossible to get a battery pack, and if you could get one, it wasn't cheap. And he said the only time that radio was turned on was for a few minutes in the evening to get the war news, and then it was turned off. And he said it would not have done had my dad walked in and caught one of us with the radio turned on. He said we would have been in big trouble. But then later, they came out with what was known as a battery eliminator, to where you could operate these battery-operated radios on 115-volt household alternating current. Now, the most common battery eliminators that I find today are the ones for the sets that are a bit newer, the ones that operate on 90 volts and 1.5 volts. But there were various battery eliminators made for various battery-operated sets all the way back to the 20s. I found this diagram for a Silvertone battery eliminator that would have probably worked with our radio. The A supply 2 or 3 volts at 365 milliamps to 670 milliamps. Adjust voltage by turning slotted shaft, and then we have B plus taps of 135, 90, 67.5, and 22.5. So that would work with our radio, since our radio doesn't require a negative C voltage. And here's the schematic. They use a 25, well, they do use a power transformer, which is good. Some cheap battery eliminators didn't even use a power transformer. They just used dropping resistors, and it made the radio a hot chassis. But anyway, we use a 25Z6 and a filter choke and a bunch of filter capacitors and a voltage divider resistor network for the various B plus voltages. And then we have what's probably a copper oxide rectifier, and then we have a rheostat to adjust the output voltage, and a couple of chokes and 3 filter capacitors to adjust for the A supply. And I think this is a picture of the battery eliminator. I had one of those about 30 years ago, but heaven only knows what happened to it, and it's the only one I've ever had my hands on. If I ever found one on eBay for a reasonable price, I'd buy it, but the battery eliminators I see on eBay are usually $50 and up for something that I would have to overhaul. And eBay's just getting to be where it's just not the place for reasonable prices anymore. And here's a battery eliminator for 6-volt radios. So 7.5 volts DC unloaded there, and 7.5 volts DC unloaded off of that tap. That must be for the 6-volt farm radios that ran off of a vibrator. And there's the supply for that. Picture of that supply that looks pretty beefy. And here's one for 90 volts and 1.5 volts. That's the more common variety. Well, it is a more common one. That one uses a tube for the high voltage and a copper oxide rectifier for the B+, and then later there was one that looked almost identical on the outside that used a selenium rectifier for the B+, and a copper oxide rectifier for the filament voltage. And here's another one, 90 volts and 1.5 volts. So yeah, there were several different battery eliminators that Sears offered back then. And here's another one here for 90 volts, 67.5 volts, and then another 67.5 volt tap. And what's the filament voltage on here? I'm trying to find out. 4.2 volts. So anyway, we'll wait till after dark and do a band scan and see what all our radio will receive. Alright, here's WSM, and yes, that dial is a bit off, so it's just going to stay off for now, because I'm not in the mood to tear this back apart and try to straighten it out, but I would just love to know where all this interference is coming from. Because that's what's killing reception. I can tell there's stuff there, it's just the noise is just overpowering it.
Doctor about either day today. Visit eitherday.com. That's IDERVAY.com.
Hi, I'm Bob, the owner of Independent Compressor Service.
Let's use the yacht boy to try to narrow this down.
Compressor Service Company. We specialize in sales and service for industrial compressor systems. Every part technician are factory trained experts will diagnose and repair your air compressor. If you need a replacement, we sell high quality air compressors and equipment to USA. Give us a call at 219.
Okay, that's 890 WLS Chicago.
At independentcompressorservices.com.
Would you surprise Ising? Chicago crop are still high. Whose job is it to fix it? Trump's or Brandon Johnson's? We talk about it. State shot at 52.2%. With 57 shots in on the midterm. He was 22 or 56. So.
Alright, that's WWL, New Orleans. I don't know what that is. Okay, that's 780 WBBM. That's 750 WSB. That's probably WGN. Yep, WGN.
I have a small portion.
That's probably WLW. Nope. Nope, that's 680 out of Memphis.
Walker Kessler stands him up. Blocks it. Wins against Turka in Las Vegas. And you enjoy is watching every baseball.
That's 670, wherever that is.
While we do the show live.
That's WSM. That's 610, wherever that is.
Threatened to burn down his house. Greene County Sheriff's Office says when they arrived on the scene, the victim's house was on fire.
They get a hold of it. Eagle's wings and they fly over. Yeah, they like it.
But if we notice on the Grundig Yacht Boy, we don't have all that noise on that, so that tells us that whatever it is getting in through the AC power line. So maybe I could rig up a battery supply to operate the Airline. Okay, I've rigged up some old batteries, and these are not in the best of shape, so we're not going to be able to leave this on very long. We have 10 9-volt batteries with an appropriate tap to get the 67.5 volts. Actually, it's more like about 73 volts. And I have these 2 D cells in series to get 3 volts, and I've adjusted the control on the back so it'll be more gentle on the tubes. So let's turn it on and see what happens, but let's kill the fluorescent light first.
Folks walking by on the Opry Plaza. First team favorite to win the 3 is 35.
I mean, there is some noise there,
We'll have it with 2 minutes. So here's what he
but it doesn't appear to be as bad as it was on the AC supply.
Now they have 16-year-olds.
Diet, and I always like cereal.
Now we're crystal clear down. 11:20 a.m., 104.1 FM, and streaming everywhere on the Odyssey app. KMOX is with you. All the power is up.
I'm a political guy. I'm sorry.
Okay, on the 90-volt rail, we're reading about 91 volts unloaded. Now, if these batteries were fresh, they would read higher than that. So let me turn it on, and you can watch it drop down. 79 volts. Now let's increase the volume and see if it goes down more. No, it doesn't go down any more. So that just tells us that those batteries are dying, because if they were strong, it wouldn't drop down that much. Now the 67 volt rail unloaded is reading almost 72 volts. And when we turn it on, it drops down to 62. Okay, it's 11:40. I'm going to have a little fun. We're just going to let this radio play on these worn-out batteries and just see how long it goes before it dies. Well, we've been on about an hour and 10 minutes on WSM, and it's still going on those weak batteries. So, yeah, I think the B Plus probably draws, well, depending on volume level, between maybe 15 to 20 milliamps, and the heater line draws about probably 300, 350 milliamps, somewhere around in there. So the heater line is especially a battery hog. We got our mumble rap gospel music. Alright, I'm back on these worn out batteries. We got, an hour and something last night. I'm going to let them run today and see how long they go. Well, we got an additional about 2 hours, give or take. So I guess about 3.5 hours total out of those worn out batteries, and then the A battery dropped down under load to something like 1.7 volts, so that's not enough juice to do this. Back on the Majestic, we had some tubes show up. I think I told you I'd ordered a 1D7 or whatever that converter tube was. Well, I got 5 of them for less than $20, so these battery tubes are generally not that expensive because most antique radio people tend to shy away from these kind of sets because they want something that they can just plug into an AC outlet and listen to. So, yeah, I'll admit that's convenient, but I still enjoy playing with the battery sets when I find them, and it's nice to know that the tubes are, for the most part, reasonably priced for them. Like I said, 5 of these tubes for under $20, and that's including shipping, so I'll have 4 more as a spare for possible future use.
Services such as student loans.
Well, they're talking about shutting down the Department of Education. I mean the Department of Indoctrination. But anyway, before I change that tube, I have it tuned to 1010, and I want to see if changing that tube throws off the alignment. Sometimes it does, and I'm still having trouble with getting this thing to track accurately, which is driving me up the wall. These are all GE tubes, look to be 1940s, I would guess, probably late 40s based on the box design. Okay, so now all the tubes are officially 2-volt tubes, so we don't have to worry about overvolting the heater on that other tube. And yes, it did shift the alignment a little bit, as you can hear. So we'll probably need to take this back apart and touch up the alignment again, go through the process again. Who knows? Our dial might actually track right now. We can only hope. Well, I'm clipped to the window, and that's WDIE coming in pretty good.
Credit builder card, and I signed up right away. How many data is stored anyway?
An example, okay? And what can you, teach to?
Get it off of him. I've heard enough of him to last a lifetime.
Appreciate that.
The group Lambert Hendricks Ross formed in about 57, disbanded in about 64, and he went out and was doing a solo thing.
WSM is a little high. Ought to be about right there.
What kind of weekend it's going to be, whether it's going to rain or whether it's going to be sunshine.
Is that WSM?
They're all coming up. The weather at 6 o'clock. Yeah. Well.
No, duh. That's WSM, and yes, it's still coming in a little high.
People like you and me
Okay, I'm ready to realign this thing. I'll turn this down a minute. Yeah, I made a little boo-boo. I was connecting my oscilloscope, using it for an output indication device, to the speaker before I removed the speaker from the cabinet, and my test probe slipped, and it ended up shorting the adjacent terminal at the very end, which is ground, and a spark flew, and the radio went silent. Well, needless to say, I was not a happy camper, because I had envisions that I had either blown open the coil on this speaker or had blown out at least the output tube. But I turned everything off and waited a couple of minutes and turned it back on, and it came back to life. So maybe it was the power supply that went into overcurrent, shut down. I think that regulator has an overcurrent feature that if something draws too much current, it'll shut it down. So hopefully that's what happened. But anyway, we're back to working now. So we have our triplet signal generator from about 1947, 10 to 456 kilocycles. And we use the Grundig Yacht Boy to set that, just like we did before, because this generator needs to be calibrated. And then we have our 1950s era Heathkit oscilloscope, one of the little smaller models, connected as an output device. And we're going to give it just enough output from the signal generator to get a usable reading so we don't kick the AVC circuit in. Alright, that ought to do it. So now what I'm going to do is adjust the slug on each transformer for maximum output on the oscilloscope. And let's see if we get that. Oh yeah. Alright, let's turn the output of the signal generator down just a little bit. And let's do the next core, or trimmer, or rather, core would be the newer type. Alright, let's move on to the next one. That brought that up a little bit. Now you want to oscillate whenever I stick my screwdriver down in that one. Well, I think that's about as good as that's going to get, so I'll go through off camera and go through them again and make sure they can't be peaked out anymore. Okay, I stopped that oscillation when sticking my screwdriver down into this particular trimmer on this IF transformer by simply clipping my screwdriver to the chassis. Now you want to be careful with doing that, because there have been times when these trimmer heads have been known to have B+ on them, so you want to check that before resorting to that method. Okay, that's the IF about as peaked out as it can get. I went through it several times just to make sure, and of course I have the generator turned way down there. Alright, so we've attached the generator to the insulation of our antenna lead. Set the generator to 1730, which is the top end of the dial on our radio, and we adjusted our oscillator trimmer for loudest tone in the speaker. Now we set the generator and then the radio to 1500, and then adjust our antenna trimmer for loudest tone in the speaker, or loudest indication on the oscilloscope. Alright, generator set to 1500. Cranked all the way up there. Yeah, now let's tune the radio for maximum signal. Alright, now let's tweak our antenna trimmer for maximum output. Alright, let's see. Yeah, that woke it up some, didn't it? Alright, we're cut to the window, and I think I am very, very, very faintly hearing 1490 WHOC. And I'm just barely hearing it on the Grundig Yacht Boy. If I hold the Grundig at a certain point where the noise level is the least, it comes in a little better on the Grundig. Yeah, if we didn't have all this noise and crap, reception would be a whole lot better, but if the Grundig's having a hard time pulling that in, then I would expect this to have a hard time pulling it in, because the Grundig has an RF amplifier stage. This one doesn't. Although I've run into some cases where some radios without an RF amp stage actually did better than some models that had an RF amp stage. I think that was 940 WCPC out of Houston, Mississippi, trying to come in. Let's see if the Grundig will do that. And the Grundig will just barely, if I hold it right, we'll see 620 WJDX out of Jackson. I think this one would too, but we just got too much noise and interference to contend with. And with the Grundig being battery operated and having a ferrite rod antenna and an RF stage, it's a little bit more immune to interference and crap. And there's no more 670 to pick up, so here we are back together, and I can just barely hear WHOC under all the noise, but it's not anything I could listen to. And the dial accuracy is still a tad off, but it's closer than it's been during this whole process. So what it ultimately took was for me to go back into this and realign it again and make sure everything was in tune. Now after dark, we'll do a band scan with this. Now as far as our alignment, yeah, I did find the factory instructions in the riders. I thought I'd missed it earlier, but it was there. Once again, I wasn't paying close enough attention, but as far as the alignment, for optimum results, you really need the procedure that the factory gives you, but for something like this, it's all pretty similar. You just need to know the IF frequency and the other alignment point frequencies, which they generally give you on the schematic or somewhere in the service information. But you just align the IF transformers, then you align the oscillator trimmer for the top end of the dial, whatever frequency that is, and then you move down to about 1500. And then adjust the antenna trimmer for maximum on that frequency. And that's pretty much it. Now other radios is much more complex, but like I said, on those you're really better off having the factory data, and in that way you can do it correctly. Now in the case of this radio, not only do you have to align things electrically, you have to align things physically is in number 1, the dial pointer has to be aligned properly, and I have it aligned straight with the 2 little marks at the ends of the dial. And then after you get everything aligned that way and are ready to put the chassis back in the cabinet, because they have the dial mounted on the front of the radio instead of on the chassis itself, you actually have to align the chassis physically in the cabinet, because there is some wiggle room there, and you have to make sure the chassis is aligned physically so the pointer will point to the right place on the dial, which is still attached to the cabinet. Like I said earlier, I think that was kind of a stupid idea. It would have made things a lot easier had they attached the dial to the actual chassis, and then the whole thing comes out of the cabinet, and then you don't have those issues to worry about. Now here they tell you that once you align everything electrically, it says to obtain dial scale calibration, tune in an 800 kilocycle signal. The pointer should be at the 800 kilocycle mark on the dial. So in order to do that, you have to tune the generator and the radio to an 800 kilocycle signal, put the radio back in the cabinet, bolt the chassis in to where it's oriented properly, make sure the dial pointer is pointed to 800 kilocycles, and if it's not, then you have to remove the chassis and then note the position of the pointer, remove the chassis from the cabinet, loosen the pointer screw, and set the pointer so that it will be at 800 kilocycles, which entails a trial and error process of loosening the pointer and moving it, tightening it back down, sliding it back in the cabinet, reorienting everything, and if it's not right, then you got to pull it back apart again. And then it says tighten the pointer screw and replace the chassis in the cabinet. If the pointer is not at the 800 kc mark, another adjustment will be necessary. Maybe 2, 3, 4, or 5 adjustments. And at this point, I'm just not going to do that. Like I said, it's still a little off, but it's closer than it's been, and we're just going to let it go with that. Now, as far as the noise, a friend was recently giving me a phone demonstration of an antenna he had purchased. It's one of these modern loop antennas that has the noise canceling features and all that in it. And he gave me a side-by-side demonstration of the indoor loop antenna connected to a radio, and he was receiving hard-to-receive out-of-town stations on it with not very much noise. And then when he connected it to the long wire outdoor antenna, the radio was picking up some of the distant stations, but the noise level was also so bad that it was making them hard to listen to. So when you have an outdoor antenna like that, not only does it pick up desirable content, as in radio stations, but it also picks up the garbage that you don't want to hear. Now, he told me that antenna was kind of pricey, but I think one day when I save my pennies up, I'm going to look into buying one, because it would sure be nice to be able to listen to these old radios as noise-free as possible. Now, as far as radio stations that I can sometimes pick up here, there's another one in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Is it 1150, 1150 WJRD, Tuscaloosa. They run an automated True Oldies format with a translator at 1013. Now, I used to be able to pick that station up here, especially earlier in the morning and late at night, or later in the evening just before sundown, because at sundown they go to low power and I can't get them at all then, although there was a time there when for whatever reason they didn't go to low power and I was receiving them pretty good at night. But I have not been able to pick that station up in forever. I don't know what's going on with them. Yes, I would prefer it be a locally programmed station, but as far as what's in my area, I would welcome an automated True Oldies channel in our area over the crap that we've got now. So what's this station's power level? 20,000 watts day, 1,000 watts night. So if they stayed at 20 kilowatts at night, I could probably get them. So I used to be able to get that, can't get it anymore. WYLS 670, years and years ago, used to come in great here. And then in more recent times, not so much. It'll give me a high signal meter reading on the Grundig, but the modulation just wasn't there, which was telling me that they're putting out a styled RF signal, but their modulation is just cut way back. And then back a few weeks ago, when we had all those storms and tornadoes, their tower got knocked down. Now, whether they'll ever rebuild, I don't know. I used to be able to pick up 940 WCPC out of Houston, Mississippi. I think that's a 50,000 watt station that runs a gospel format. Occasionally I can still get them, but not much anymore. But we're talking years ago when all this was possible, and that was pre-switching wall warts and cell phones and LED light bulbs and everything else that creates noise that, when it's all combined, obliterates the AM broadcast band. So I guess the next thing we're going to do to our radio, not in this video, it's gone on long enough, but I want to build a power supply for this, which shouldn't be too difficult to do, but I would like to do that. And I might build a battery box for this as well, so I can run it on battery power. But on batteries, this is not something that I would run constantly, because the batteries will not last nearly as long as what they would in a transistorized set. Okay, I was wrong about WCPC, 31,000 watts day, 7 watts night. And you would think I would still be able to pick them up a little bit better down here. Maybe their signal is directional, and that's the reason we can't get them. But yeah, they run a Christian format, and they've been a Christian station for probably 40-some-odd years. But apparently WCPC airs a locally produced The Sacred Harp Hour that's been on that station since 1959, so that's quite a long run there. Okay, WHOC in Philadelphia, 1490, has been on the air since 1948, July the 31st of that year to be exact, and they run 1 kilowatt day and night, so yeah, that would be a little bit hard for me to get here, 30-something miles away, especially with all of the noise. And it says on Wikipedia that they run a news, talk, and sports format. Now, I can remember when they ran that format. Actually, I can remember before that when they were running a Music of Your Life, soft AC format, because I remember calling them in the early 2000s whenever I was looking for a radio station turntable, and the lady that answered the phone was very nice, and she said, yes, we still have turntables, but they're still in use. She said our morning guy likes to play 45s on the air, so they're still in service at the moment, so we can't get rid of them. And then they switched to news and talk, Rush Limbaugh, that sort of thing. And then I guess they figured out that wasn't working because the stations in our area can be heard there, so, you know, I guess they figured wasn't no use in running a format that another station that could be heard in the area was also running, so then they switched to classic country, which I feel like is automated, but they do still run the funeral announcements and the local news and local community announcements and such stuff that small town radio generally does, and that's what we need more of. I just wished I could receive them better. And apparently they are locally owned. They're not owned by some conglomerate like Odyssey or iHeart or anybody like that. If any of those outfits ever got their hands on them, then they just ruin them like they do everything else they touch. Alright, enough rambling on. We'll wait till after dark, and then we'll do a we will do a band scan of the radio and see what we can receive. But yeah, like even my wall oven from about 1998, it's all digital, and whenever I turned it on, started hearing popping in the radio. So yeah, virtually everything nowadays is just an interference producing AM obliterator, and they really need to crack down on that. Hear that popping? That's from the oven. Well, this volume control seems to be acting up again. You remember earlier in the video it was misbehaving. So we're at minimum volume now, and I'm turning it up.
Of his life watching him. Games of his life. So here's the thing. I feel like
I continue to turn, and not much is happening.
He could have had those games. He could be a quarterback that's saying after every game, hey, I want.
Well, now it's starting to behave better. Before, it would be minimum, and then as you were turning it, it would ramp up a little bit, and then go back down, and then increase.
all over the field.
Now, if the volume control is twacked, then there's not much we can do about that, but I wanted to open it up one more time and investigate the distorted audio at lower volume levels. And I believe we have this R6 here that's a 2 meg, but in circuit it reads over 4 meg, so more than double its rated value. We'll want to look into that. And then we have this 6 meg resistor that one end connects to B minus, the other end connects to the AVC line. In circuit it's reading about half, so we'll want to look into that too, as well as look into these bias resistors, 150 ohm and 100 ohm, because if those are out of whack, that could cause some distortion. So let's go look into. Alright, that's reading 4 meg, so let's get that out of there. Well, usually heating them up makes them go down. Out of circuit after I heated it up, it went up slightly to 4.2 meg. So that's a very unstable resistor, apparently. And this 6 meg resistor, now that I got that other resistor out of the way, is reading 9.3 megs, so it needs to go as well. Before, it was actually reading less. Alright, 6.8 meg and 2.2 meg, which are the standard modern day values that will generally substitute for the 6 meg and the 2 meg respectively. And out of circuit, that 2 meg is actually a 4.10 meg, and that's a 10% resistor silver band, so that thing is well outside of its 10% range. Alright, that takes care of that. Now let's see if it performs any better or worse or about the same.
How old is he? 9?
Alright, we no longer have distortion at low volume.
So, yeah, he'll be fine. What else?
The volume control is still a little bit haywire, but we're just going to have to live with that.
Today or yesterday?
And we have no antenna on it except this little stub sticking out the back. And we got a microphonic audio output tube too that I can put my hand on top of it and press firmly and it'll stop. But that was pretty common for these little low voltage battery tubes.
It's here. I don't think people realize how much a...
Alright, that's just about on 1450. That's about on 1390.
Standard strap.
We'll see more once.
1010 is slightly off, as is 910. But like I said, it's just going to have to be that way because it's better than it was before.
The larger numbers, there will be more one seeds than we're expecting. That's what I'm saying. That was what's more like
Okay, I guess that's about all I've got until about 9 or 10 o'clock tonight, and we'll do a band scan and see what this thing brings in. But for a battery set with a pen drive magnetic speaker that I had to patch because of my careless stupidity, it sounds pretty good, and it has a good amount of volume. Yeah, just checking the 4 caps that came out of that radio. I think this is the screen bypass cap. It's leaking a bit at 200 volts. It could be a lot worse, but I decided to go ahead and replace it because since it has B+ on one side, if it were to short, then that could cause problems. A .01, which would be either the volume control coupling cap or the grid coupling cap for the output tube, and it doesn't even check like a capacitor as far as value is concerned. I got a little leakage there at 200 volts. The other .01 not giving us any kind of eye-opening either. No leakage there. Little leakage at 200 volts, which there's no voltage in that radio higher than 90s. And last, the AVC filter of .05, and I'm not getting any kind of eye opening on that one either. And that one, as it happens, is the leakiest one in the whole radio. You can see it's leaking pretty badly there at 20 volts, which is in reality more like 50. Yeah, so that capacitor is gone, but then again, there's not that much voltage on the AVC line anyway. So 4 paper capacitors, 1 electrolytic capacitor that's still attached to the chassis, 3 dog bone resistors, and 4 tubes, and an alignment, and some wire replacement, and we're back in business. And like I said, that's the first time in over 36 years that I've ever seen all of the tubes in a radio be bad, not counting sets where some idiot would wire the battery plug wrong and blow the filaments out. I've seen that a few times, but I have never seen a radio where all 4 tubes were just worn slap out. And like I said before, normally, when I see that, I would think of some shyster had switched around the good ones for duds and then sold the radio and played stupid, but seeing as how all 4 tubes were branded as Ward's Airline, I don't think that was the case. Well, it's about 5 in the evening and 1180 out of Jackson is coming in. Using my body for an antenna. Mark is in. I don't even know if he comes on one of the FM stations here. I know he doesn't come on 1010. That's 1490 WHOC coming in a little better, but still not to an enjoyable level though. Well, I think I finally received WJRD after forever and a day of not being able to pick it up. We might better listen to that for a little while and enjoy it. It seems we have another music station at 1150 that's trying to fight for the spot here. Yeah, that's pretty bad when you got 2 music stations contending for the same spot on the dial. I'll have to go try and look and see where that other one was from. station trying to come in playing Bebop Baby by Rick Nelson. Well, looks like MOX has dead air again. Just to be sure, let's check that on the Yacht Boy. 10, enter. Yep. Strong carrier, no modulation. There was a time a station would have been severely fined for that. And if that didn't get their attention, they would be severely without a license. Yeah, we're starting to get some stuff and noise. There's WSM. Let's leave it there for a while.
Greg Lynch, pivoting towards retirement radio hour.
1510 WLAC out of Nashville coming in.
Bedminster, New Jersey, the President. Bases full, Hawk 2-2 pitch, breaking ball foul back. Got a piece of.
Where is all this noise coming from?
Here to get a good job, it's who you know, not what you know. Well, here at Ready to Work, we think both.
That's probably WDIA.
That's why he has
MOX is back.
Americans trust My Patriot Supply, the leader in long-term emergency food storage.
Right down the same grade, and they want to spend.
You mentioned him before, Conwell, 16 points a game right there with Fremantle. Yeah. Go under a screen.
890 WLS Chicago.
The National EMS Academy Division of Acadian Ambulance.
That's WWL 870 New Orleans.
Car, you can be held to be covering your space. Is that really what we are? 833 Joe Patty, 833 someone's out there.
It's 820 WBAP.
Get them to realize the truth.
It's WBBM Chicago.
And our top story this hour is
That's WSB Atlanta, and I found an air check by them that someone posted on a site the other day from New Year's Eve 1988, and they were still playing music at that time. And during their music era, during the 80s, they were broadcasting in AM stereo. But there's not that many AM stereo receivers around. The only one I ever had any dealings with was the Delco radio in my mother's 92 Buick Century. It had AM stereo capability. And at the time, we had a station, 910, that was running an R&B, hip-hop, rap format, and they were broadcasting in stereo, and it sounded decent as far as the audio quality went.
Contract to ever sign is no subscription ever.
That's 720 WGN Chicago. That's 690, the Catholic radio station out of New Orleans. It was WTIX many years ago. That's probably 700 WLW. Let's see.
Broke away on a monster dunk. Completely changed the game. Kentucky went on a 10-0 run.
Formerly known as the Nation Station. And if this had been a Crosley radio, it would have had it marked on the dial, seeing as how Crosley owned the station. WSM. Okay, that's about it. Well, considering all the noise we're having to contend with, it's doing pretty good.
Yeah, everybody.
670, wherever that's coming from.
A couple years ago to breakfast and looking at this elderly couple that was next to me and clearly had been married for
680, the sports station out of Memphis.
And both of them.
Big day for this team.
To the 2 to 8-year-old. Listen closely for an exciting offer.
But Anthony Edwards has been unselfish enough. This is the first inning where the Razorbacks either the first or second batter reach base.
I'm just going up the dial here. That's something at 950. Yes, I'm using the Grundy Yacht Boys digital tuning to help me kick these stations out.
They pack it up and they come to Texas. Now this benefits us on the right.
That's something at 960 that's fading away. That's some Spanish station. That's 1040 coming in.
There's no better firearm.
Pretty good.
New sponsor, Sig Sauer.
1070 DIA coming in kind of weak. And I don't know what this is. I'm not getting it on the Grundy.
San Antonio 80, Philadelphia 64.
San Antonio.
Radio 1200, WOAI, San Antonio.
Okay, well I wasn't going high enough up on the Grundy. It's 1200 WOAI. And we had 1040, what's that, WHO? 1120 KMOX.
Back in a moment, Golden Eagle Baseball from Learfield.
Looks like another win for the...
Okay, well it's getting all the usual suspects. It would do a lot better if, like I said, we didn't have all this noise. And we're about full on the memory, so that's a good enough place to say I hope you got something out of all of this mess, and more to come later.